William Rees is joining us as our speaker. I'm just going to give you a quick bio so you know where William is coming from. He's a human ecologist, ecological economist, former Director and Professor Emeritus at the University of British Columbia School of Planning in Vancouver. His research focuses on the ecological requirements for civilization to persist, energy assessment, and the behavioural and socio-cultural barriers to change. Best known as originator and co-developer of ecological footprint analysis, Professor Rees has authored hundreds of peer-reviewed and popular articles. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see this presentation. Okay, are you seeing that, William?
I am. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. So just let me know when to hide the slide or switch the slides. I'm just going to hide myself from the broadcast, but I can still hear you.
I'm just going to flap my finger or something. Okay.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. I guess everybody can see where I'm headed here. I will be talking about the human ecological footprint. So you can move on. And I want to put this in context, right? That what we're really talking about is a process called overshoot. And in many respects, Tara's presentation highlighted this, that the population of deer has overshot, obviously, the historic carrying capacity of those islands, and it's completely altered the ecosystems of the islands. And humans have done the same thing for virtually the entire planet. And we're now in a situation where we can see numerous planetary scale changes occurring as a result of excessive human use of natural resources. So we see greenhouse gases accumulating, climate change, oceans are acidifying, fresh waters are toxifying, we're overfishing, soils are eroding, and so on and so on. And what I'd really like to emphasize as we get going here is that everyone today is focused on climate change. But climate change is just one of all of these co-symptoms of this much bigger problem of overshoot. And the irony is that all of the focus on climate change is counterproductive, because everything that we're proposing to do to address climate change will, first of all, not address climate change. That's a whole other presentation, but it's going to worsen overshoot. So all of the symptoms that we're looking at here are going to get worse. Overshoot is a meta problem. And by that, I mean that it's the cause of all of these other things. So they are the symptoms of the meta problem. And what overshoot means is that the human enterprise greatly exceeds the long-term carrying capacity of the planet. If all of these trends, and there's many, many more, continue, then we're done for. This will destroy the ecological integrity of the ecosphere. And climate change will be just one, it's going to accelerate, and it will be one of a number of accelerating symptoms that will simply make a civilized life impossible. So I think it's important to recognize that overshoot is a terminal condition in the end. Let's carry on. So this really leads to the first question of human ecology. And as a kid, I used to lie awake I was a farm boy, so I used to lie awake at night staring at my ceiling thinking about how much of land do I need just to keep me going? Every one of us is utterly dependent on the productivity of the ecosphere to stay alive. So it becomes a valid question to ask how much of the ecosphere is needed to support just you in the style of which you are accustomed. So that's my first question. Move on. So as time went on, I developed in the course of my professional life this concept of our ecological footprint. And it was an attempt to answer this youthful little question. So definitionally, your ecological footprint is the area of land and water ecosystems required continuously, because it's ongoing, isn't it, to produce all of the biological resources that you or any other population consumes, and to assimilate the wastes that you produce. Consumption always leads to waste production. In fact, everything we consume ultimately re-emerges into the ecosphere as waste. And so we're now drawing on resources all over the planet. And so we have to consider our eco footprints as extending all over the planet. Another thing to keep in mind is that land that is required, or ecosystems required to support population A, are exclusive. They cannot support some other alternative population. Move on, please. Okay, In effect, ecological footprint analysis inverts the carrying capacity ratio. So carrying capacity asks this question: how many people could this area support indefinitely at a specified standard of living? We don't ask that question anymore. The young woman who introduced the session made the point that economists have said, well, it's an irrelevant question for human beings because we can trade and technological advances enable us to increase the carrying capacity of our particular area. So it doesn't make any sense, they say, to ask how many people can this area support. I think this is a complete delusion, but we'll get to that in a moment. Ecological footprint analysis asks a slightly different question, and that is how much area is required to support this population at any specific standard, no matter where that area is. So again, instead of asking how many people in this area, okay, we've got these people in this area, but they don't live there ecologically. If they're living on goods imported from somewhere else, we can still compute the area that is required to sustain them, even though that may be half a planet away and accessed through global trade. So another thing that ecological footprint analysis does is enable us not only to assess the demands that people are making on ecosystems by measuring the actual ecosystem area, wherever it is, needed to support a population, we can compare that to the supply of biocapacity. So if we look at the Gulf Islands, for example, and we were to calculate the ecological footprint of people who live on the Gulf Islands, well, I know we would. I used to live on Gabriola, and I did it for Gabriola Island. The population there, which is relatively small, vastly exceeds the carrying capacity of Gabriola Island. There's no conceivable way that the islands could support the populations that they currently have on them. And that's because, again, economists, well, we've raised the carrying capacity. No, we haven't. What we've done is extended the reach of those people through trade and imports to somebody else's carrying capacity somewhere else. So we're all living on borrowed carrying capacity. Let's move on, please. So if we look at this in terms of international circumstances, we see very quickly that ecological footprints, the amount of area needed to support any individual person or a nation, is very, very much dependent on income. Income also means consumption. Almost invariably, as incomes go up, consumption increases. So high-income countries have very large ecological footprints. It takes, for high-income countries, between 4 and 10 average global hectares, that's 10 to 25 acres, to support a single person in terms of all the biomass and fiber and so on needed to sustain that individual, plus to assimilate our waste, particularly our carbon dioxide. That's the carbon sink function that is being overloaded because of excess use of fossil fuels, and hence we're seeing a climate change. So the carbon footprint is a big part of the ecological footprint. Now, the poorest people on Earth live on 1/3 to 1/2 of a hectare, which is obviously a tiny fraction, less than 10% of the lowest end of high-income countries. So there's a great misallocation, in a sense, of resources, or at least unequal allocation of resources that depends very much on incomes. So the ecological footprint clearly reflects the great disparity between rich and poor, which we're seeing increasing between nations as well as even within nations. The rich people are getting more and more, and very poor people are sharing less and less of a global economy. Now, there's several important things to understand here. First of all, if it is true that our average footprints in rich countries varies from 4 to 10 hectares, we can compare that to what's available on the planet. And I don't care how many books you consult or geographical analyses you rely on, we can show that there's only about 12 to 13 billion hectares of ecologically productive land and waters on Earth. Most of the oceans, for example, are effectively a biological desert. So this means there's only about 1.7 average hectare per capita on the planet of land and water sufficiently productive to support human populations. So that we in North America, with our footprints of around 8 hectares per capita, are using 4 to 5 times our fair share of global carrying capacity. Next. This is what it looks like, just a spread of countries. United States, Australia, Canada are very high footprint countries. Way down at the far end are some countries in Asia and Africa, such as Bangladesh and Malawi. So it's a very steep gradient from wealthy to poor. But the thing to keep in mind is this horizontal red line. This represents what I call, what analysts in this domain call one planet living. So that if we were all equitably sharing the biocapacity of Earth and living on our equitable share, our fair share, we'd each get about 1.6 hectares. Well, as I say, we're in Canada taking 4 or 5 times that amount. And this is the standard of living that we would enjoy, something like the level of Peru or Ethiopia. That is what the Earth could sustain indefinitely, representing the carrying capacity of the planet. And by the way, we're not taking into account here the needs of non-human species. There's another big problem, and that is that although there's only 1.5 or 1.6 global average hectares available on Earth per capita, the average eco footprint of the human population today, even at today's very unequal standards of living, is 2.7 gigahectares, or average hectares, not gigahectares. So in effect, we're using the Earth as if it were about 73% larger than the planet actually is. Next, please. This just gives an example of individual countries. The green bars represent domestic biocapacity. The red bars represent the amount of the Earth's productive biocapacity required by the populations of those countries. And you can see that most of the European countries are dependent now to a very large extent on imported carrying capacity. Some very poor countries are in that state as well. Canada is among a very few countries on Earth where our nominal biocapacity greatly exceeds our actual demands. But don't let that fool you. I've been told in Ottawa a number of times that we're in great shape because we have so much surplus, but we don't. We trade this all off. 63%, for example, of our prairie lands, half of our forest products and fisheries are sold off in the world markets to sustain people in countries with an excess footprint over their available biocapacity. So when economists say we increase carrying capacity by technology or trade, it's not quite true. What we're doing is shuffling carrying capacity around the world so that people in very wealthy countries through the market can access the surplus carrying capacity in the few countries like Canada that have a surplus, or like Malaysia where incomes are so low that they don't consume all of their own biocapacity. So the point is most countries in the world today are dependent on surplus biocapacity that they import from other countries. And they are running what I call an ecological deficit. The ecological deficits of countries is vastly more important than their physical or economic deficits, and yet no one pays any attention to them whatsoever. Because what an ecological deficit means is, certainly on a global scale, is that we are living not on the annual productivity of our ecosystems, but we're using all of that plus some of the natural capital. So fishery stocks are declining, our soils are being eroded, tropical forests are disappearing. We are literally consuming the biophysical basis of our own existence and pretending that we're increasing carrying capacity because it's made all invisible by trade and so on. Next slide, please. Globally then, in 2017, that's the latest numbers, the human footprint was about 20.9 billion hectares. The global biocapacity was only about 12 billion hectares, and so we're 73% larger. We're using the Earth as if it's about 73% larger than it actually is. So what this means is that further growth of the population and incomes, material consumption, can occur only by depleting essential natural capital and through the loss of life support functions. And that means we're fatally compromising future well-being. And those of us in British Columbia who've watched the ravages of fires and heat domes, and most recently these extraordinary floods in the Lower Mainland, know exactly what this means. These are the products of the excessive human ecological footprint on planet Earth. And the more we promote economic and population growth, the worse these conditions are going to get. And climate change isn't going to abate because of our efforts to abate climate change. Move on, please. So what we are missing, right away, you can move, click the button again, something like 4 planets. If everyone on Earth lived the lifestyles of North Americans, we would need 3 or 4 additional Earth-like planets to support them at our material standards for sustainability. Next. We're into a situation which nobody talks about. Everyone approves of economic growth, but what about non-economic or uneconomic growth, a concept developed by a colleague called Herman Daly, one of the deans of ecological economics. So as economic growth increases along the x-axis here, obviously there's a great gain from that, but there's also costs increasing as the scale of the economy increases. So for much of the development of the human enterprise, the gains from growth, the marginal utility, if you like, of growth exceeded the costs of the disutility. But you reach a point right here where the two are equal. And what that means is that if you continue to grow and consume, both in population and the use of energy and materials, then you pass the point where the disutility, or the costs of growth, again, think of all the damage costs, the billions of dollars damage costs of recent climate events, exceeds the benefits of that growth. And that makes your growth useless because, in fact, growing further is making you poorer rather than richer. So there is some optimal scale to the economy at which there's a coincidence between the marginal gains from growth and the marginal costs. And we've long passed that in the Earth, I believe, at this point. Next, please. So the real sustainable challenge is that we need a new cultural narrative. We need to have a discussion nationally and globally that shifts the emphasis away from efficiency and growth, which really means just getting bigger, toward equity and development, a qualitative improvement, or getting better. So the overall goal of global development planning should be, and this just sticks in the craw of most people, a smaller, steady state economy, supporting far fewer people living more equally within the biophysical means of nature. Now, that seems to most people to be an impossible goal, but I assure you that if we don't achieve this, and then the future will achieve it for us. Nature's revenge will be a much smaller population living in chaos on a much smaller economic base, because we are literally, and again, I can't underscore this enough, all of those symptoms that we listed in the second slide are indicators that we are literally eroding out from under ourselves the foundations of the existence of not only the human species or civilization, but non-human species as well. We won't destroy the planet or the ecosphere, but we can make it essentially uninhabitable by human beings. Next, please. So the really inconvenient truth, and look at this. This goes back to 1973, and it's actually a report of the International Business Council on Sustainable Development. And they recognized then, based on all kinds of data, that industrialized world reductions in consumption, energy use, and environmental degradation of 90% will be required by 2040 to meet the needs of the growing population within the planet's ecological means. North Americans, by our analyses, the footprint analyses, should be taking steps to reduce their ecological footprints by 75 to 80% down to the fair Earth share. Western Europeans should be thinking about a 60% reduction. Now, again, put that in the context of a world that expects to grow indefinitely and at least at the rate of 2 to 3% per year. That pathway leads to chaos and destruction of the ecosphere. This is really what you need to do to become sustainable. Next slide, please. There's a convenient truth associated with these details. This curve represents the nations of the world plotted against life expectancy of various countries against per capita incomes. And life expectancy is just a surrogate for any number of variables of population health. And what you see is a very strong correlation with rising income. You get better and better until a certain point, at which point, beyond which there is no further improvement. So if we are destroying the planet by going from, say, 20,000 to 50,000 a year with no improvement in life quality as indicated by life expectancy, This is unnecessary growth. And we can see this happening in Canada. One study showed that between 76 and 2006, a 30-odd year period, the Canadian economy grew by 130%, per capita GDP by 70%, but there was no change in the percentage of the population in poverty or in the unemployment rate, which means there were a lot more people in poverty and a lot more unemployed people. So the absolute numbers of impoverished and employed increased, and subjective well-being, people's sense of how well off they were, was constant or declining through this period. So we are actually gaining nothing at all by additional income growth. What we need to look to is shrinking and more equitable distribution of what we have. Next slide. So here's the bottom line, and I think you have to take this very serious. In the coming decades, the human enterprise will contract. It will contract because we choose to do so, or because nature will impose its own solution. And we're beginning to see that happening. A lot of the habitat on this planet will become uninhabitable in the next few years. In fact, it was interesting this morning listening to the reports of the recent floods that some people lost not only their homes, but literally the land has eroded away. They lost their property because of the recent flooding. Well, again, it's a small example here, but it's indicative of what we can look forward to at an accelerating rate in the future. So we can choose business as usual, and that's what governments are choosing. That's what came out of COP26, business as usual. But this risks a chaotic implosion imposed by nature, which will be followed by geopolitical turmoil and resource wars. You may be hearing now about the US and Russia getting increasingly tense, between the United States and China, increasing tensions, and basically over land and resources when you really boil it all down. Or the human community can rise to full human potential, and we are intelligent enough to see what's happening, and come together to cooperate in planning an orderly cooperative descent toward what people keep talking about as a socially just sustainability for all. That's the ideal, but we're not doing anything really to achieve it. Can we move on, please? All right. The good news is that we actually have the technology to induce a 75 to 80% reduction while still improving quality of life. We just don't apply it. We don't act. Privileged elites with the greatest stake in the status quo control policy levers, and ordinary people hold on to the expansionist myth, so we remain in a state of eco paralysis. Move on, please. Humans have been socially engineered to ignore reality in this age of what the Oxford English Language Dictionary called, it's the post-truth era, where bullshit appears to be of equal value to scientific truths. So most of us prefer the bullshit if it makes us feel good or means that we don't really have to act. We will always go to the theater of a reassuring lie and avoid the inconvenient truth. Move on, please. So simplistic thinking, the human way, leads us to think that wind turbines, photovoltaics, electric vehicles, smart cities, geoengineering, and all of this stuff is going to help us. The world full of electric vehicles will not be a better world for a whole variety of reasons. Again, another topic. And then a world full of internal combustion engine vehicles. This stuff is really nothing more than growth-bound business as usual via alternative means, and will lead to a formal collapse of the global ecosystem. It's simple, but wrong. The complex but right way of thinking about this is moving towards smaller eco footprints, lifestyle changes, greater equality, population planning, some form of degrowth leading to improved well-being, including eco-stability and economic security. In other words, if we have overshot the carrying capacity of the planet, as is clearly shown through eco-footprint analysis, we need to reduce the scale of the human impact and human numbers to the point where the planet can support us. Next slide, please. And I think this is the last one, but it's something really important to think about. What is ecologically and socially necessary for sustainability is not politically feasible. And we saw that again at COP26. But what is politically feasible, the sorts of things that politicians will currently entertain, is ecologically and socially ineffective, if not catastrophic. And I guess that's really the final message. We have to change the dialogue to make those things that are necessary also feasible in political terms. Thank you very much.